Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Ben Buchanan. I'm the co-founder of NovoPsych, and we're joined tonight by Dr. Aaron Frost, who's going to be talking to us about better outcomes through benchmarking, and in particular, the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, the 10-item version of that. Many of you will know Dr. Aaron Frost. He's been a leader in clinical psychology. Welcome, Aaron. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah,
there you are now.
Thank you.
Welcome. So many of you will know Dr. Aaron Frost, who's a clinical psychologist and been a leader in clinical research and teaching for a number of years. For a decade, he's been a passionate advocate of the use of routine outcome monitoring. And he's recently released the Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale 10 in a published article to make routine outcome monitoring just that much more convenient for us all. He's also the leader of Benchmark Psychology, which is a large private practice that uses the principles of routine outcome monitoring to really enhance the treatment that the clinicians provide. He is a certified trainer with the International Center of Clinical Excellence and was awarded a fellowship of the APS for his advocacy around client outcomes and return on investment methodologies. So Aaron, hey, welcome.
Thanks for that. That's quite a mouthful and a big bill to live up to. So thank you for that.
Well, you're very impressive. When I was emailing everyone, I did say that you're Australia's leader in routine outcome monitoring. So, I think that's actually true, right?
That might be true. I don't know. There might be other people, but anyway, we'll see. Look, that's fantastic, Ben. Thank you very much. For those of you who are already using routine outcome evaluation, you might find that some of the stuff that I'm talking about is a little bit remedial, because I guess I'll be explaining why you might actually want to do that in the first place. So we'll start the story there as to why you'll do routine outcome evaluation. Then we'll move into the DAS and why we actually develop that and what the pros and cons are, because like any measure, it's not perfect. I'm not here to spruik the DAS and say that it solves all of the world's problems. It certainly doesn't. But I'll tell you what problems we were confronted with and why we invented or developed the DAS and how it solves those problems for us. And then move into how we've been using it over the years, and more excitingly, how we're starting to use it in an integration with NovoPsych, which I guess brings me to declaration of conflict of interest. Ben isn't paying me for the webinar tonight, but our team are using NovoPsych for free while we're figuring out how to make it work properly and how to get the best out of it. So we're actually in the process of doing that at the moment. So I've been a user of NovoPsych on and off for a number of years, and have been using it more intensely over the last few months, and will be using it as my daily driver within a couple of weeks. So thank you, Ben, for that. But I think it's always important to declare any financial interest before we get started. All right, so let's get moving, and I'll just quickly bring up the slideshow that I'm working through. And I guess the starting point is, how do we actually get better outcomes clinically? Like that's the thing that we all care about. Like when the patient or the client walks through the door, we know that there's another half a dozen to a couple of dozen people who are sitting outside, and they're hoping that whatever happens behind your door is going to be helpful for their brother or their daughter or their wife or their husband. Yet we know that that's not going to be the truth for a lot of people. I saw someone comment a few seconds ago, coming from the UK. The UK with IAPT has been a real leader in terms of publishing routine outcome evaluation. But even so, we know that not everyone is benefiting. So how do we identify who is benefiting? And how do we use routine outcome measurement rather than just measuring and quantifying whether we're doing a good job or not? How do we actually use it to improve the job that we're doing? And that's probably the bit that I'm most interested in. So before we do that, let's maybe start with this idea of what is excellence? What actually makes people top performers? Because we know it intuitively. our APS Code of Ethics specifically says that I can't say that I'm a better psychologist than you, and you can't say I'm a better psychologist than me, and Joe Bloggs can't say that he or she is a better psychologist than Sarah Smith. But we know that when one of our family members phones up, or one of our friends, and says, hey, my kid needs to go off and see a psychologist, or hey, my husband needs to go off and see a psychologist, none of us say, hey, just pick up the yellow pages and find someone near you. Jump on the APS website and find somebody who's convenient, or find someone who's cheap. We intuitively know that some people are better at this than others, but our intuition as to who's better doesn't necessarily line up with who actually gets the best outcomes. And in fact, the research has been really clear on that. So if we look at some of the stars that I've put up here, their achievements are quantitative. We know what they've achieved. We know that they might be the best. In the, thank you, someone's just corrected me, social worker and family therapist. Thank you. When I use the term psychologist, please correct me as using that for psychotherapists. I apologize for that up front. So we know that some people are achieving at a high level. In psychology, we typically haven't looked at that, psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, we typically haven't looked at the individual characteristics of the practitioner. We focus much more on the characteristics of the practice. So it's CBT versus ACT, it's ACT versus IPT, it's therapy A versus therapy B, whereas the research suggests that that is probably not where the bulk of outcomes are being, sorry, I'll just turn my microphone down a little bit. It's probably not that the key is in the different types of therapy. The key is actually in the therapist. Okay, so let's start off by thinking about this. In terms of therapy, we've known for many years that it works. The dirty little secret from outcome studies is that typically there's a greater difference between the best and the worst therapists within any treatment group than there is between treatment groups. So if we do CBT versus ACT, we know the dodo bird effect finding tells us that the most likely outcome is that we'll hit a statistical dead heat. Therapy A is not superior to therapy B. But if we look at the top quartile of therapists from therapy A and compare them to the bottom quartile of therapists from therapy A, that's where the difference is. Okay, so that's the starting point. Some therapists are better than others. Now, interestingly, this is true even in drug studies. Okay, some people get better outcomes giving pills than other people. Interestingly, it's true even in the placebo arm of drug studies. So some people get better results giving Tic Tacs than other people. So somehow it's not necessarily about the active ingredient, it's about the contextual factors that are wrapped around that. Fascinatingly, and this is quite an old study now, but it's one of my favorites on this, Hite and Hargrave in 1995 asked a bunch of therapists in one of these treatment studies to estimate their own effectiveness. And fascinatingly, the therapists who were the least effective rated themselves as the most helpful. So let's think about our field. Our field, in many ways, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We have a bunch of people here who have made up the thought in Western psychology and psychotherapy. My question for all of you, and this is a rhetorical question, how do we know that these guys and girls are any good at what they do? We all attend the training workshops, we all attend the seminars, we all buy the books. How many of them actually have an evidence base? Now, I'd probably suggest that about 3 or 4 of them have a profoundly strong evidence base, but not all of them do. But that hasn't the degree of influence that they've had in the shaping and the development of psychotherapy is possibly disproportional to the evidence around their effectiveness. So what we've had over the course of the last 70 or 80 years is an imitation approach where we've tried to distill the essence of therapy from a whole range of different people. For any of you in the top left there, top right, I've got Marshall Linehan. If you read the first chapter of cognitive therapy for borderline personality disorder, It's a beautiful description of how we've taken this approach. It describes an excellent therapist who was getting better outcomes than everyone else, and everyone watched the videos and tried to iteratively figure out what was it that she was doing with these clients that was leading to the great outcomes. Okay, so we've taken people who are top performers and then we've tried to distill their essence. In many ways, this is consistent with the Freudian idea. If you look here, this is the Freud Couch from the Freud Museum in London, which I know is a genuine photo because I got kicked out of the Freud Museum in London shortly after taking that photo. So I apologise for not seeing the sign to our friends at the Freud Museum. We've got this idea that therapy is a series of techniques or a series of moves or a series of strategies. So we learn the moves, we learn the strategies, we learn the techniques of these master therapists, and then we try and implement them in our own practice. If we go back to that slide that I showed of great musicians, great sports stars, great innovators, we don't necessarily become good. I had a picture there of Serena Williams. Serena and Naomi Osaka, two of the best tennis players in the world. Naomi Osaka is not going to be better by copying Serena's moves, and Serena will not become better by copying Naomi's moves. One of them is twice the size of the other. Both of them have to figure out how to optimize themselves as a unit rather than necessarily imitate a series of techniques and skills. So really the ideas here, I'm kind of cribbing from a guy called K. Anders Ericsson. Anders Ericsson has, to me, the best job title in the world. He is the world expert in expertise and expert performance. I should say the late K. Anders Ericsson. He passed away, sadly, last year. Ericsson spent a lifetime looking at what made some people better than others in a range of different disciplines. And increasingly, this work is now being looked at in psychology. For those of you over in WA, our colleague Daryl Chow over there has been doing work on what is it about these super shrinks? What do they have in common? What does their training regime look like? So in many ways, our therapeutic outcomes have been stuck for many, many years. We're not actually getting better at what we do. And the two approaches that we've taken, one is this learning specific technique, so the imitation model. And the other is the idea that great therapists are not made, they're found. So there has been some research done in identifying who is most likely to get the best outcomes in psychotherapy. We take a bunch of super shrinks, we give them a whole bunch of questionnaires, find out what they have in common. We find a series of stable personality characteristics that tend to be high in self-awareness, concern for others, sensitive to case complexity, intelligent, flexible, open, creative, nice to puppies. Okay, I made the last one up. But the point that I'm making here is that the statement list, as I've seen this body of research, they just feel like motherhood statements. I've sat on interview panels for my own practice. I've sat on interview panels for universities. I've never found this list of super shrink characteristics particularly helpful in terms of identifying who's going to get better outcomes or not. So let's have a look at what the research actually tells us is associated with better outcomes. Excuse me, this slide here I've taken from Great Psychotherapy Debate by Bruce Wampold. I just want to take a second to highlight something here. Now, what we've got on the y-axis, so for those of you who slept through undergraduate statistics, the y-axis is the uppy-downy one. On the y-axis, what we've got here is Cohen's D. I apologise, PowerPoint has just cut off a little bit of that image, so I apologise up front for that. So what we've got are what are the factors that lead to the biggest amount of change within psychotherapy. Then on the x-axis, we've got all of the different factors that have been studied and then meta-analytically or experimentally dismantled. What I really love about this graph, the thickness of each of the bars in the histogram there represents how much research has been done. So if we have a look, and I'll just take a second to, I hope you can see my cursor there, the single greatest factor that contributes to therapeutic outcome is this thing that we don't spend a lot of time teaching our students at all. This is goal consensus. This is actually spending the time to figure out if the client wants to meet the same goals as the therapist. Empirically, it's the single greatest contributor towards getting good outcomes here. So finding a congruity between goals is absolutely critical. Then we look at what we do spend all of our time studying and researching. Comparison between different modalities. So the thickness of the bar is 70 years of evidence-based practice research, but the height of the bar is relatively small. Please, when I say this, please don't interpret this as me saying I'm not attacking evidence-based practice. I think it's really important that we actually work from within an established evidence base. But some people are better or worse at working within that evidence base. So these are all techniques of working within the established evidence base, but looking at optimizing your outcomes. And the starting point is that we need to think about goal consensus. We need to think about how do we make sure that our goals and the client's goals actually line up with each other. The next slide I want to share, and this is one that gets misquoted to me all the time. Everyone would be familiar with this pie chart idea, and we've all seen it, the idea that extra therapeutic factors contribute X amount of change and Therapeutic Alliance contributes Y amount of change, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a couple of things that are wrong with this image, because I get this quoted all the time, and students say things to me like, oh, I'm working on Therapeutic Alliance. Yeah, but what are you actually doing? Well, I'm working on Therapeutic Alliance. Okay, well, what are your goals? Well, I'm working on Therapeutic Alliance. What are the client's goals? And it can be really frustrating. So I want to point out a couple of things here. Firstly, this quote, Therapeutic Alliance is the most important factor contributing to client outcomes. I've stolen that from every psychology graduate ever. Actually, there's 5 missing words. Let's see if we can pick up on them. Therapeutic Alliance as rated by the client is the most important factor in contributing to client outcomes. Actually, the research is pretty clear that Therapeutic Alliance as rated by the therapist, it doesn't correlate with Therapeutic Alliance as rated by the client and is not a predictor of outcome. Okay? The second thing I want to highlight here is this idea of extra therapeutic factors. I often see people saying, oh, I'm focusing on extra therapeutic factors, which means, helping the person get a job or working on relationship or whatever. Actually, they are part of the therapy. Extra therapeutic factors, whenever you see a slide with somebody saying extra therapeutic factors, trouble in your relationship, trouble at work, bullying, et cetera, that probably means that they didn't read the research, because extra therapeutic factors are not those things at all. Extra therapeutic factors are error. Extra therapeutic factors are the things we didn't measure in our models, okay? So a focus on extra therapeutic factors is not a therapy, even though it is the largest part of the outcome. That's not to say therapeutic factors is where we should be focusing. That's saying there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't know. Okay, our models are not able to predict with the level of precision that we might like who's going to get the best outcomes. All right, moving along, and I'm conscious of trying to move through this background stuff to actually get to the DAS stuff. So I just want to highlight some things. Who are the best therapists? Who actually get the best outcomes? This is probably one of the biggest studies that's actually been done into this issue. 580 real-world therapists, 6,400 real-world clients. On average, 10 sessions, 40% depression, 30% adjustment disorder, PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, etc. Trying to predict who got the best outcomes. Now, this is really important. Training doesn't make a difference. Okay, training doesn't make a difference. The level of training that you've experienced beyond a certain point, and it is worth knowing this is an American study, so everyone here has at least a master's. There's no argument that any level of training beyond that makes any difference. Profession makes no difference. The psychiatrists don't get better outcomes than the psychologists. The psychologists don't get better outcomes than the licensed social workers. all of the groups were roughly equivalent. Experience makes no difference. Whether you've been working for 6 months or 6 years, 6 years or 20 years is not a predictor of client outcome. And this is really important to note too. Diagnosis wasn't a predictor of outcome. Now that's counterintuitive to a lot of you, and I know it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around that. And the reason here, it's not that diagnosis is not actually important, it's that it's completely subsumed by severity. Severity is a big predictor of outcome. But a person with a very quote unquote poor prognosis diagnosis, like a personality disorder, someone with a high functioning personality disorder has a significantly greater opportunity or greater likelihood of improving than someone with actually quite a simple disorder, say an emetophobia or a panic attack or an agoraphobia. That person, if they are very low functioning, that person is at much greater risk of either deterioration or non-successful therapy outcome than actually the quote-unquote worst prognosis. Worst diagnosis. All right, moving forward, because I want to get into this experience issue a little bit more. I think this is a really fascinating one. It's counterintuitive to people. We often think that we're just doing this thing and getting better and better and better at what we do. But actually the research doesn't support that. Again, I'll take a second to just orient everyone to this slide. And again, I apologize, PowerPoint's just cut off the reference there. The reference is Goldberg et al., 2019. If you take a second, the y-axis here is Cohen's D, so the overall effectiveness of therapy. The x-axis is number of years, and each of these individual lines represents one clinician's career. Okay, and this is a model where the researchers have attempted to find the line of best fit that represents each of these clinicians' career. Now, there's a couple of things that are really interesting to point out here. And just take a second as I'm talking to have a look at that data and see what you think it says and what you can infer from that data. The first thing that I'd point out is the main effect. We're not getting better. In fact, the line that I've drawn in there, that red line, that's the average, and it's down. Okay? Actually, the research tells us, and this is consistent with the findings of the authors, the research tells us that actually the more experienced clinicians are not the ones getting the best outcomes. I've got 20 years of experience. I've been practicing since 1999. There's no evidence to suggest that I should be getting better outcomes than one of our registrars. And in fact, typically one of our registrars beats me and the other senior practitioners here. We are invariably beaten in terms of our outcomes by new graduates. The second thing I want to point out here, and this was counterintuitive to me, what I really expected to find was that a small group of people would be improving, a small group of people would be deteriorating, and the large majority of people would just sort of be flatlining with no improvement and no deterioration. And actually, that's not what this research finds. If you have a look, and again, I'll use my mouse here, so just, I know it doesn't show up fantastically on Zoom. We have a group who have improved over the course of their career and a group who have deteriorated. There's not a flatline group. So what I take from this research is that you're either getting better at your therapeutic outcomes over time or you're getting worse. Okay? And if you're getting better, it's probably because you are doing some specific things that look more like training in psychotherapy and less like experience in psychotherapy. Okay, training versus experience. Or a different language would be practice or deliberate practice versus experience. Because 20 years doesn't necessarily mean 20 years of practice. 20 years might just be 1 year of practice cut and pasted 19 more times. So let's think about what actually reduces our effectiveness. So if you're thinking about your line on this graph, where are you right now? If you're thinking about what are the numbers that contribute towards that, there's 3 major factors. The first one is early dropout. In most real-world studies, 30% of clients will drop out early. What's the definition of dropout? Now, the definition of dropout, the consensus definition And I use this because there's international benchmarks that I can compare against too. So I've got something meaningful. So if you want to grab a pen and paper for anyone who would like to grab this, because this is an easy one to calculate in your practice. I'll give you some numbers right away that will give you a sense as to how well your practice is performing. Firstly, greater than 0 sessions. So this definition of dropout doesn't look at people who don't engage. There are benchmarks for that too, and IAPT has been a real leader in publishing those, but I don't want to focus on that right now. I just want to focus on therapy dropouts. These are people who've actually met their therapist. So they've had a single session with their therapist and they've decided not to come back. Or they've had a second session with their therapist and then they've decided to not come back. Okay, so the definition of dropout is greater than 0 sessions, less than 3. Once a person has a third session, we don't include them in dropout anymore. The reason we use an algorithm, and again, an algorithm like this is imperfect. It's a clinical indicator. We will get false positives and false negatives. I have one client, she's in her 60s, she's a self-funded retiree. She comes every year on her birthday for a single session of therapy just to check in and see if she's living her life consistently with the decisions that she made last year. She counts towards my dropout statistics every year because she comes for that single session of therapy. Similarly, I'm absolutely sure that there's people who come and see me 3 times and decide that I don't know what I'm talking about, and then they decide to leave. Okay, so we do get false positives and false negatives, but the reason that we use a consensus definition algorithm like that is that if we let clinicians determine what dropout is, we find one of 2 things. We find incredible neuroses. So some clinicians consider that anybody who leaves prior to all of their goals being achieved is a dropout. So by that definition, you'll end up with about a 95% dropout rate. Similarly, and I, hand on heart, swear that this is true, I spoke to a clinician at an NGO where I was doing some consultancy. And this person had a dropout rate of 85%. And I remember discussing this with the person just to try and understand, did she have a different clientele or was there something going on? Because sometimes when you see these things in the data, there's different ways of understanding it. And I asked her, why do you think that is? Why do you think you've got so many people who come in for 1 or 2 sessions and then don't come back? And she said, because the kind of interventions that I do are so powerful that no one would need to come back for a 2nd or 3rd session. So when we've got that level of disparity in terms of how we as clinicians define dropout, we have to work on these algorithmic definitions. So everyone's got that algorithm, greater than 0, less than 3, no future appointments booked. You will typically find in most outpatient ambulatory settings that there is a dropout rate of about 30%. Okay, it is the single biggest factor that contributes towards poor outcomes for our clients is the fact that a third of clients come along and then disengage before they get any benefit. If you're a cricket fan, you would know that there's only so many ducks that you can score as a batter before your overall average starts to deteriorate. Okay, so dropout contributes to that duck effect because those dropouts often count as 0 in terms of our overall effect size. Now, there are evidence-based processes that you can put in place to reduce your dropout. We typically, at Benchmark here, we typically run a dropout rate of between 10 and 15%. Sometimes it blows out to 20. Sometimes we see individual clinicians who get into single digits, but we definitely aim for below 20. Often when I get asked to come and consult for organisations, this is one of the first statistics that I'll calculate. And often the organisation is asking me to consult because they know that they've got a problem. And often the dropout rate looks more like 60 or 70%. That is quite typical. So one of the first things, if you're an individual clinician out there in Zoom land, or if you're a practice owner or a service director or somehow, or a funder, somehow associated with deciding whether therapy is getting good outcomes or not, one of the first things that I'd recommend that you have a look at is dropout rate. If it's 30%, you can do better, but it's acceptable. If it's pushing much beyond 30, that's a problem. And I would say that that is the first order problem to focus on, is how to improve your dropout rate. Second thing that we know is in effective therapy, in real world settings, as many as 60% of clients do not experience clinically significant gains. So we've got a whole bunch of clients who are coming along for therapy, but not actually getting any benefit from it. And there's two problems with that. One is that that's not a great use of service resource. Two, the clients aren't getting the goals achieved that they're aiming for. And three, when it comes to therapeutic burnout, the corollary statistic of this that I would share with you is that of the 60% of clients who aren't experiencing gain, around about 20% of those will stick in therapy indefinitely. Okay, so think about that for a second. You see 100 clients in your first year. 60 of them don't get better. Of that 16, 12 of them stick with you into year two. In year two, you don't take on 100 clients. Now you take on 88 clients. And of those, 60% of them don't make any improvement, and 20% of those stick around indefinitely. You can do the math in your head, but you can see that it doesn't take that long until your entire caseload is filled with people that you are not achieving great outcomes with. And that's a huge burnout risk. So that's an issue for us at a purely self-interested level. That's an issue for us as clinicians. And then the last one is harmful therapy. Therapy is not the right thing for everybody. We know that 5 to 10% of people get worse during the course of therapy, and we need to identify who those people are so that we can make sensible decisions as to whether we should continue with therapy or whether we should discontinue with therapy. Okay. I'm just going to skip that for a second because I'm conscious of time. So I just want to provide a quick little visual metaphor here. I imagine standing there out at a golf course. It's a driving range at night. We've got a bucket of 50 golf balls, and we hit them out into the driving range. Now, if we wanted to get better at what we do, we'd hit 10 and see where they go. They all pull to the left. So we go and talk to the golf pro, and she says, adjust your hands a little bit. I adjust my hands. Now they're all pulling to the right. Okay, adjust your stance a little bit. Okay, now they're all going straight. Okay, now we'd hit another 10 and another 10 and another 10 to try and actually lock in the muscle memory for what we're doing right. Okay? If we want to improve at something, we make iterative changes and then measure the effect of those changes. Now, I'd like you to imagine, while you've got that visual metaphor in your head, I'd like you to imagine that we leave, like in this picture, we leave the lights on where you hit the ball at the tee, but we turn the lights off out on the driving range. And now you just hit 100 balls. You've got no idea where they go. Can you get better at your swing under that scenario? And I'd argue that you can't. All you've got is your feel as to how they're doing. In therapy, we need to turn the lights on because the metaphor here, for those who haven't made the connection, the golf ball is the client. And many of us don't hit 100 golf balls. We see 100 clients over the course of a year. And we have a feel as to whether they go in the right direction, but often we don't know. And year on year, we make small iterative changes. We adjust our grip. We learn some ACT. We learn some CBT. We learn some EMDR. We learn some schema therapy. We learn a whole bunch of little techniques and tricks. We adjust and we adjust. But maybe it's possible that 5 years ago, we had a purple patch and we were doing fantastically. Then we adjusted and we lost it. Maybe we've just been adjusting endlessly and we're not getting any better at all. Without actually knowing what your outcomes are, you can't know whether you're already in a purple patch and now the goal is to just maintain it, or whether you're still searching to figure out your swing. So we need to track outcomes and we need to ask clients for feedback. And I'm just going to focus on the outcome side of things today because that's the bit that fits in best with what we're doing with NovoPsych. But the other piece of this is seeking client feedback. But let me talk quickly about the DAS and how we use it. And I'll tell the story as to why we invented this. Developed, I guess is the right word. My journey with outcome evaluation started in about 2006, 2007. And I was using the OQ45, which is a 45-item measure which tracks client outcomes. And honestly, just from using that for 6 months, I was absolutely convinced this was career changing for me. And it's gone on to actually define my career in many ways. Not only did it give me the humility to realize that I wasn't a super shrink, I was actually an average shrink. It gave me the humility to realize that. It also gave me the confidence to know that I wasn't bad. And I really sat there for a long time struggling with confidence of wondering, was I actually doing a good job at, seeing all of these clients day in, day out? And I could see that over time that would have really eroded away. So the OQ45 was really life-changing for me. I started going down the path of talking to other people about this and sharing what we'd learned with the OQ45. And it didn't matter who I talked to or how often I said, I have seen 50 clients, I've seen 100 clients, I've seen 150 clients. They all do the OQ45. I've never been able to convince a clinician that the OQ45 is not too long and too big a burden. And everybody tells me my clients won't do it. Oh, but my clients did do it. Yeah, but my clients won't. So I needed something shorter. The ORS, the Scott Miller suite, had been out there for a number of years. The ORS has a few problems in terms of the psychometrics. The psychometrics, I think the wording that Scott uses in his publication is that the psychometrics are acceptable, and they do meet the threshold of acceptable. But I've never been, I can be a bit of a research purist here, and I've never liked the idea of 4 subscales that have 4 items. That doesn't actually make mathematical sense to me. So that was a problem. And the other problem was something that I realized prior to becoming a clinical psychologist. I worked as a research psychologist for many years. And one of the things that I realized was that if you want to get clinicians to track outcomes and be involved in real world research, you have to make it easy. You have to make it easy and streamlined. So something that I wanted to do was to actually integrate the practice management software and the actual outcome suite. So I wanted to put those in the same place. So we actually had to build our own software to do that. And at the time when I did the research to see what was out there, all of the tools that were available were licensed. So no one would give me permission to actually build it within the software, which is what I wanted to do, to actually have it integrated. So I was really lucky. I remember I do peer supervision with a guy that some of you would know, Kim Halford, Professor Kim Halford. And Kim and I were just chatting about this problem. And he said, actually, something I've been wanting to do for ages is to take the DAS and to cut it down into a short version. If we did that, that would probably meet your needs. And I said, well, if you did that, we'd collect a lot of data and that would probably meet your needs for the psychometric side of things and the publication and the academic side of things. So Kim and I got together on this almost 10 years ago now. Kim took the published data that's already been available on the DAS-21 and the DAS-42 to look at the individual statistical characteristics of each of the items. We developed a 10-item. Some of you will be counting and realize it's actually a 12-item. 10 of them contribute to score. 2 are actually signals. So one of them is a suicide item and one of them is a drug and alcohol item. The other 10 contribute to the score. We developed these 10 items based on the known statistical properties, and then we piloted it. So when we had, I think, a few hundred cases in the first instance, we did some statistical analyses and found that all of the items were performing the way they should. And it's taken us a number of years because, again, I'm not a researcher anymore. No one's paying me to develop psychometric instruments. So it took us a number of years to find the time and the inclination to actually do this, by which point I think we had about 6,000 cases of the DAS. We've been using it extensively since 2013. Every clinician at Benchmark will be using the DAS-10 every session for every client. Our completion rate is about 97%. So we can say with a fairly high degree of certainty that the outcomes that we're achieving here kind of give us a true representation of the effects that we're getting. I will put a caveat there and just say that the completion rate did drop during COVID when we were no longer able to give the questionnaire to people directly on an iPad. Sending it to people beforehand, as much as I like that, we do find that the completion rate drops. let me have a talk about, because this is out there now in 2021. So Kim and I published this year. It's not perfect. We've only done a single evaluation on this. So let me talk about the things that it's got and the things that it's missing. It's got good internal consistency, Cronbach's alphas and all that sitting over 0.8s, I think about 0.88. Good discriminant validity. The community mean is just over 3. The clinical mean is almost 13. So we've got a really good discrimination between case and non-case. The construct validity holds up really well. It's got 2 factors, but those factors, what we were really looking for was a single scale. We're really looking for a single scale here. And the 2 factors both highly loaded onto one higher order factor, which basically we just think of as symptoms or distress. So we basically just add up. None of them are negatively scored, so we just add up all of the items, and that gives you a total score. You can then track that total score over time. We were very lucky. We were given permission by Peter Loverbond. Some of you would know Loverbond and Lovebond, published the DAS 42 and the DAS 21. Sid Loverbond unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Peter Loverbond is still with us, and he gave us permission to do this. Part of his consent was making sure that we were always very clear that this was not his tool. This is very clearly a different measure that's suiting a different purpose, but also that it remained free, which was our goal too. We really wanted to make sure that this stayed in the public domain. This is something that someone can take and incorporate into their outcome tracking software, or that they can incorporate into their practice management suite, or they can incorporate into their quality assurance processes. So I'm actually enormously delighted that Ben has chosen to take it and incorporate it into NovoPsych, because it's something that we developed specifically to meet a clinical need that we had. And now it's available to other people. And if you have the same clinical need that we had, you might find that this is a good tool. Things that we don't have, and I'm very conscious of this, test-retest reliability is still unknown. We have the test-retest data of all of the individual items that's already been published. We have not published test-retest. It's a really difficult statistic to run in a real-world setting. You don't typically phone up your clients and say, oh, by the way, you did a questionnaire for us 3 days ago. Would you mind doing this again? Part of our ethical approval was that we were allowed, the ethics committee gave us permission to use the data that we were collecting as part of routine clinical service. So anything that we wanted to add over and above routine clinical service was specifically prohibited from our ethics. So I'm really hoping, because it's not a perfect measure at the moment, I think it'll do okay, but the publication, for those of you who are more of the psychometrically OCPD end of the spectrum, and I'll be honest, I'm one of them, you'll have a look at our publication, you'll find that there's a few gaps. I would be enormously delighted if you'd like to incorporate it in one of your studies and actually publish on those gaps. But yeah, to me, the test-retest thing is probably the big one that's sitting out there. Good constructability, good sensitivity to change. We found that the Cohen's D for benchmark was 0.76. So our entire practice, our 6,000 odd people, came in with a sensitivity of change of a Cohen's D of 0.76, which is consistent with the literature. The meta-analytic literature says that we should be achieving somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7. So I'm pretty happy that we're sitting kind of comfortably in that pocket. But it also kind of says that the measure must be doing an okay job of picking up on change if we're sitting within that pocket. And a reliable change of 5. So, more than 5 points of change is considered reliable. It's worth knowing that's derivative though, so that RCI has been calculated with test-retest from previous publications. So that one still sits there as a, if you want to challenge that, that's still open for debate. The final thing, clinical cutoff is 7, which actually fits nicely at a face validity level, because we'd been using it for about a year or so as an experimental measure, and we felt like it was about 10. So just on the face of it, it felt like people with scores of less than 10 were subclinical, and people with scores of over 10 were clinical. So it was interesting that the math came back and told us that actually the cutoff is about 7. So it's a simple tool, it's free, it's available. And it's simple to actually to get the license. There is no license. Just grab it, use it as you want. Please include a reference to the Lovabond and Lovabond paper and our paper so that people can appropriately cite it, but it's available for you. What makes me feel more confident that it's meeting a need, I put it out there just as a, one of those little humble brags that you put up on LinkedIn. Hey, we just did a thing, because I've got to say this, of the various things I've published in my life, this was not, this went in behavior change, and not to mock behavior change, but, I've certainly published in higher journals. We kind of put it there because it's a local journal and they're trying to do good things, and it's very applicable for clinicians. So I just put it up there almost ironically on LinkedIn. I don't think I've ever seen something move so quickly. It got like 10,000 views within about 24 hours. And fascinatingly, I've already had a request, which we've granted. Someone has translated it into Urdu. So that is available for a Pakistan client. I can't comment on that at all in terms of the translational process, but I understand that it involves forward translating and backward translating, and then making sure that you come up with the same instrument. And there is a Malay version that's in the progress, in the works. So I do feel like there's a need out there for free and adaptable tools that allow you to session by session respond. Okay. I just want to show you how we use it, and I'll point out these are actual clients which I've then gone and entered into NovoPsych. So I apologize. If you look closely, you'll see that some of the dates are dummy dates, but these are real clients. So first off, this is John. One of the things that I'd like to point out about John, just take a second and have a look at that graph. That's kind of how therapy should look. Okay, if all of your clients look like John, you would be a super shrink. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. The first one, progress between session 1 and session 2. It's a really good indicator that you're going to get some good outcomes if you see some progress between session 1 and session 2. And in fact, the absence of any progress between session 1 and session 2 is almost a sign that you're heading in an adverse therapeutic direction. So I really want to highlight that issue, because actually when you look at session 2, if you see no progress, it's really worth stopping and discussing, are we on the right track here? Do we have goal consensus? Do we have anything that's available in terms of thinking things through to get a better therapeutic outcome? So this is John. Saw John for 6 sessions, got a great outcome. Now let's move on. This is where we start getting something a little bit more interesting. Okay, this is Kay Frankham, who's out there. This one's not named after you. We renamed Sarah. I used to call this person Kay. I've renamed her Sarah now. For those of you who don't know, I do training workshops with Kay, and I always felt weird talking about a client who had the same name. What we've got going on here with Sarah, again, nice pattern of improvement. And then we see, and this is not unusual, when you see, and again, I hope you can see my mouse, you see improvement followed by small deterioration and plateau. If Kay's progress chart, let me just go back. If Kay's progress chart looked like that, you'd probably consider that a successful outcome. But the fact that then it continues to deteriorate, it helps us to identify that a relapse is on the way. Kay's actual story here, Kay presented for a range of things. She had an adjustment disorder, stress at work, and there'd been a critical incident that had occurred that she'd accessed therapy as part of an employee assistance program after a kid had thrown themselves through a plate glass window. That was what had brought her into therapy, but that wasn't actually the major issue. The major issue was just life dissatisfaction. When we were doing an assessment and finding out a little bit more about Kay's story, Sarah, I've been calling her Kay for a while. When I was finding out a little bit more about Sarah's story, she revealed that she was actually just drinking at fairly industrial levels. And we had a fairly quick psychoeducation intervention about just reducing her drinking. I referred her back to the GP because her level of drinking was quite dangerous. And the three of us agreed together that she would halve her drinking and then halve her drinking again and halve her drinking again. And actually, therapy here, yes, there's a psychological element, but most of this gain has come from drinking reduction. She's reduced her drinking. She's lost quite a bit of weight. She's commenced a relationship. She's feeling better at work. Her anxiety has improved. Her depression has improved. Everything's going so great that guess what she decides to start doing to celebrate on a regular basis with her partner? She starts drinking again. And it's really fascinating because during this phase, I feel like her and I were working together. During this phase, she wasn't telling me about drinking. She didn't tell me that she'd decided, actually, I don't want to be abstinent anymore. I'd like to have a few drinks. And it was actually when I presented the data to her at this stage, at that second last session, said, Kay, what's going on here? This is not just a plateau. You're actually getting worse. What's happening that you're not telling me? And she said, I've started drinking again. And then we had a discussion about that. And me, in my somewhat blunt fashion, said, well, let's have a look at the data. When you're not drinking, you get better. When you start drinking, you get worse. What's the decision that you need to make here? And she decided to actually cut back to a longer period, a 12-month abstinence period. And this is actually the outcome that we see here as a result of that. Okay. Just a couple more. I'm conscious of not boring you with too many of these. And that's in the wrong order. Let me show you. Oh, actually, no, sorry. Let me show you this one. Brad. What we've got going on with Brad here, Brad is a dropout. And Brad is an interesting kind of dropout who has made rapid change. So if you have a look on the scale here, he's kind of starting with a 23 and then moving to an 11. Okay, so he's improved really, really quickly. And we see a lot of Brads out there who will have a single session, and this was exactly his story. He came in telling a story. We had a chat about a bunch of different things we sort of started formulating, and he wanted to do it all. He wanted to go for a walk every day. He wanted to catch up with old friends. He wanted to do mindfulness and take up yoga and quit drinking and give up on gluten and all of the things, right? And surprisingly, he felt really good after doing all of that stuff, but it's not sustainable. So Brad represented. So Brad dropped out after 2 sessions, and then Brad represented approximately a month later. Approximately 3 months later. So we do need to be kind of conscious of when we see those rapid improvements. The goal really has to be to try and make sure that the improvement is maintained over time. And the final one I want to show you, this is Rose. Why I'm showing Rose here, this is therapy failure. This is therapy failure. And this is exactly what her pattern looked like. A little bit better, a little bit worse, a little bit better, a little bit worse. It's atypical. Normally, therapy failure looks more like a complete flat line or a complete flat line with sort of little bumps on it. That kind of seesawing pattern, I've never seen exactly that before. But it's such an interesting illustration because for me, there's a real question there of therapeutic dose. For someone like Rose, cognitively, what's going on for me is not wanting to abandon them. I don't want to give up on them. I don't want to take away therapy because therapy, might be helping them. Maybe if we did one more session and one more session, one more session. But there's a really good chance that if you've done 7 sessions with someone, other 7's not going to make a difference. So for me, the question here has to be, how long do we stick with these people versus when do we refer on? And for Rose, I actually referred her to a colleague of mine. And I followed up 6 months later, and she'd had a fantastic outcome within about 3 sessions. The presenting problem here is panic disorder. Generally speaking, a priori, I would have predicted that she would have made significant improvements on panic within 3-4 sessions. So, in fact, the absence of that improvement is a really good sign that we're not heading in the right direction. So I felt really comfortable actually referring her on. So for me, where we use these tools is to identify on the way we change therapy. And there's a number of things. When therapy is not working, we change it up. Maybe this person hasn't responded well to CBT. Maybe we should try something different. Maybe this person hasn't responded to ACT. Maybe we should try something different. Similarly, we see people who've made those rapid gains. and we look at trying to prevent dropout. And finally, we actually spot people who are deteriorating, and we look at providing different outcomes. Ben, can I check for time? Are we pretty much hard up against time, or like is the webinar about to just shut off in 60 seconds time?
We did schedule it for an hour. So I reckon, if you've got about a few more minutes to go, I reckon we do that. And then perhaps if we go to questions.
I'll just talk for a couple more minutes and I'll skip over a few things. The final thing, and this is other people's data, so I'll ignore that. The other thing that I really like here, the two more things I want to point out. One is choosing which cases we want to talk about in supervision. So I just want to highlight, we've got some data here. This is an intern. Okay, we're seeing they've got 7 clients. This is their age, and these are their scores. So this person's come in on a score of 21, score of 20, score of 18. They would not be a high priority for me in terms of talking about them in supervision because they're getting better. Okay, whatever the therapist is doing, they should just keep doing it. Okay, then we've got, sorry, I'm looking on the wrong pointer here. Then we've got Abdul here, who's starting on a 35, going down to a 7. He's a high risk of dropout. So he would be a priority for me to discuss in supervision with my intern. And we've got Tran here, 28, 20, 16, 15, 11. Unless there was a specific risk there, I wouldn't be talking about Tran. Supervision is such a precious resource. I wouldn't be using it for someone who's getting better. Paula, 11, 8, 14, 16, 15, 17, 14. It looks like she's getting worse. Paula would be a high priority for me to discuss supervision. Harry, 25, 23, 25, 26, 23, 23. He's not getting better. And he's coming off a fairly high base. So he's a high level of symptoms. So he would be a big priority for me to talk about in supervision. Pater, 14, 8, 6, 4, 5, 5, 3, 4, 2. I'd probably be wanting to talk about when do we terminate therapy. There might be good reasons for sticking with someone who's getting positive results like that. Maybe she's just had a job change and she wants to make sure the changes settle in. There could be a range of different reasons for wanting to stick with someone in that instance. But as a supervisor, I'd be wanting to ask the question, why are we still seeing this person? And then finally, Sophie, 24, 15, 6. She's getting better. She wouldn't be a high priority for me. So one of the other things that we do with this data is that we use it for our supervisors to decide which are the cases that they want to put the time and effort into kind of going into depth. Because I really feel like as a supervisor, I'm unlikely to value add to someone who's already got better. I'm not going to make them get betterer because I've got some great formulation. Similarly, someone who's just long-term not making any progress whatsoever, there's possibly nothing that I'm going to add there. The people who I am going to add for and that I have potential to value add are for the people who should have changed but who aren't. Final thing, and then I'm conscious of everybody's time, especially I noticed a couple of people coming in from overseas, so I'm conscious of God only knows what the time zone is there, so I'm very conscious of sticking to time. I just want to point out, this is the last slide here, and this is just, it's a different way of thinking. This is actually the caseload of our best clinician from last year. Okay, so this is her actual caseload. Obviously, their name is not AA, AB. I've anonymized their names. So this is their names. This is their sex. This is age. This is how many sessions they had. And this is how many points of change they had. And I just want to point out, I've ranked that by points of change. I just want to point out why she was the best practitioner. And it comes down to this thing that I'm calling distributional thinking. Because we often think about that one client that we hit it out of the ballpark with. And when you're there on the couch for 1 hour, that's the person that you're thinking about because we're meant to be. That's what we're trained to be thinking about. But the difference between the best therapist and the worst therapist is this. There's 4 quadrants. There's the people who got worse, people who dropped out didn't make any gains, people who made small gains, and the people who made big gains. What makes her a better therapist than anyone else in the team is the size of that green segment. Okay? If we look at how big that is, that's almost half of her clients made clinically significant improvement. She still had people deteriorate. Okay? And the worst practitioner, and I hate to use the word worst, if I was to show you the worst practitioner, or my data, I'll show you my data. If I was to show you a more average or in fact less accomplished practitioner, what we would see is a reversal. We'd see a lot more people who deteriorate, a lot more people who drop out, lots of people who make small gains, and then a small group of people who make big gains. And the difference, that's all it is. Okay, it's not about the magical technique or anything else. It's about the number of people that you manage to move into each of those different quadrants. All right, I'm conscious that I've been ignoring questions for the last 5 minutes or so. Did you want to facilitate some questions, Ben, or do we just have to wind up here?
No, let's do some questions. If anyone does have some questions, please put them in the chat. We've got a question here from Helen. She asks you, Aaron, how do you determine clinically significant change? So I think you said 5 points, and also NovoPsych will compute this as well if you're using it in NovoPsych.
Yeah, we just use the two cutoffs that I use in my head. 5 is the RCI, and the other one that I use, I happen to know that the pooled variance is 7. So 7 is like 1 standard deviation of change. So anyone who's getting 7 points of change is like dragging your effect size in a really positive direction, and anyone who's getting less than 7 points of change is pulling your effect size down. So again, it's not all about the numbers. You don't want to be getting into gaming the system for, achieving numbers. But I do have that in the back of my mind that when I'm looking at an individual supervisee's data, and let's say they've got a Cohen's d of 0.4, I'm really looking at that cutoff of, okay, so how many over 7s do they have? How many under 7s do they have? And different people have different problems. Some of our supervisees and some of our clinicians have a dropout problem. That person needs a totally different set of remedial actions than the person who's getting great outcomes with a bunch of people, but then, adverse outcomes with another bunch. Actually, we had this recently. One of our better practitioners, and this will give you an indication of how good she is as a practitioner, probably 20% of her clients were deteriorating, but on the other end, she's just got so many people that she's having great outcomes with. And she's coming from a very psychodynamic, very in-your-face, very intense analytic framework, which for some people is leading to big change, but for other people is not impacting them so well. So for her, it was a much more nuanced conversation of how do we keep the great stuff that's in your technique, but how do we hurt a few less people along the way? And I'm conscious of time, so I'm being a little bit...
And I suppose with that, Aaron, I mean, it sounds like, no clinician can expect to see benefits for 100% of their clients. And so, like you said, it's just the proportion of whom is benefiting and who's deteriorating, who's having no change. And of course, you won't know that unless you're measuring it. Some of the questions coming up here, people are asking, Aaron, what's the age range that the DAS-10 is suitable for?
Yeah, I'm conscious that I haven't looked at that. Sorry, let me give 2 answers to that. We've been using it for 14 plus, and we're liking it for 14 plus. I'm conscious that I don't have the paper in front of me. I have a feeling that for ethical reasons, we had to only include people 18 plus in the data set. But I feel like that's a question that's caught me off guard enough to not have a definitive answer on that.
I think in the DAS-21, Lovabond says there's no reason why you can't use it for people that are less than 16, but that it's sort of on the discretion of the clinician to know how someone younger than that might take it. People are...
I'm just conscious practically 14 plus, but psychometrically, I don't want to lie to you and say, yes, it's been well validated at 14 plus. And
some people are asking, Aaron, how often do you use measures? Should you do every session, weekly, monthly, so on?
Great question. Every session, because if therapy is going in the wrong direction, the sooner you know that, the better. And I think about it for myself. Like if I'm going to the doctor, or I'm taking my kid to the doctor, I want to know if they're getting better, because if they're not getting better, I want the doctor to change the medicine or change the approach. And the sooner we notice that they're not getting better, This to me is the real difference between measuring your outcomes so that you can stick it up on a dashboard somewhere and say how great we are, versus measuring your outcomes so that you can detect failures early and then fix them.
Some people are asking, Aaron, how do you structure the session? Do you do the DAS at the start, the middle, or the end? Do you discuss the graph with the client?
There's a bunch of stuff in there. Yes, we discuss the graph with the client all the time. Actually, that's not true. We should discuss the graph with the client all the time, and we get better outcomes when we do. It's always at the beginning of the session. And my logic here is last session, we did a bunch of stuff. And we did a bunch of stuff because I had a theory about which stuff would be helpful. So you might have come in and you had some cognitive distortion. So I chose to do some cognitive challenging. And maybe I sent you away with some homework for cognitive challenging. The best way of testing my theory is to see whether you made any progress. So if my theory was that you've got some cognitive distortions and that my therapeutic approach was for you to challenge them, if your data hasn't improved, either my theory is wrong or you didn't implement the thing, which says that my therapeutic relationship is wrong, or my way of explaining it didn't get across to you. And so the starting point is to know, was the thing helpful? And then if it wasn't helpful, then I guess is it a relationship problem? Is it a poor explanation problem? Or actually was my theory wrong? And actually you don't need to challenge your cognitions. You need to do something different.
Yeah. And
if you did get some gains from cognitive therapy, then maybe I'll do a bit more of that this session and see if we can get some more gains.
Yeah. Aaron, Helen asks, does the DAS-10 provide depression, anxiety, and stress subscales, or is it purely used for a general measure of distress and overall outcomes?
Yeah, it does not. We actually don't recommend trying to calculate the subscale. So our factor analysis very clearly didn't find that there was 3 subscales. We found 2. The anxiety and the depression scale kind of blended into one, almost like measure of arousal type of thing. And then there was more anhedonic type of things on the other scale, but they were so highly correlated with each other. We've always, because first off, until we did the factor analysis, we didn't even know that there was that underlying structure there. We designed it as a unidimensional measure. We use it as a unidimensional measure. And it's so much easier to see signal on one of these graphs than it is to see signal when there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. So yeah, that's why we use it.
Cool. Great. Well, I think we've answered most of those questions. Oh, there's one coming. There's one more. Thank you so much. Enjoy the session. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback, Laurie. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for tonight. Really appreciate it. You really are a leader in getting clinicians enthusiastic about routine outcome monitoring. I'm a believer, you're a believer, and I think many of the attendees tonight will have become a believer as well. So thank you very much. And thank you for all the attendees as well.
Thanks, guys.